Sabi blackjack?
Sabi food, sabi squaw.
Oh, nice. Very nice.
Imagine trying to survive on foods most people today wouldn't even recognize. That's exactly what Native Americans did. And the surprising truth about their diet is far stranger than the stories you were told. Long before grocery stores existed, Native Americans had already figured out something that would make modern nutritionists jealous. They called corn the staff of life. And honestly, they weren't exaggerating. This wasn't your basic yellow corn from a can either. These folks were growing dozens of different corn varieties that would blow your mind. Blue corn, red corn, white corn, striped corn. It was like a rainbow exploded in their fields. Each type had its own purpose too. Blue corn packed more protein than regular corn. Red varieties lasted longer in storage. Some types worked better for grinding, others for popping over fires. But here's where it gets really clever. Native Americans didn't just throw seeds in the ground and hope for the best. They built mounds of soil mixed with fish scraps and wood ash. The fish provided nitrogen, the ash added minerals, and the raised beds drained better. Smart, right? They also figured out crop rotation centuries before European farmers caught on. Then there's the whole grinding situation. Women would spend hours turning dried kernels into meal using stone mortars and pestles. The cornmeal became everything. Thick porridges, flatbreads cooked on hot stones, and even fermented drinks that packed a punch. Storage was another game changer. Dried corn kernels got tucked away in tightly woven baskets sealed with pine pitch. Some tribes dug underground cellars lined with bark and grass. These storage pits kept corn dry and cool, protecting it from hungry rodents and harsh weather. A good harvest could feed a family through an entire winter. The weird part is how versatile corn really was. Fresh ears got roasted in their husks. Dried kernels were ground fine for delicate breads or left coarse for hearty stews. Some tribes even made corn silk tea. Nothing went to waste. Different regions developed their own corn specialties too. Southwest tribes perfected paper-thin cornbreads. Eastern tribes mixed corn with beans and squash in massive cooking pots. Plains tribes learned to dry corn quickly before moving to new hunting grounds. What made corn truly special wasn't just its nutritional value. It was reliable. Unlike hunting or gathering wild foods, corn provided predictable harvests year after year. Families could plan ahead, knowing exactly how much food they'd have stored. This reliability meant tribes could grow larger, build permanent settlements, and develop complex cultures. Corn literally built civilizations. Speaking of building something amazing, corn didn't work alone in Native American agriculture. It had two very important partners that created one of the most ingenious farming systems ever developed. Now that corn was standing tall in Native American fields, something brilliant was happening around those sturdy stalks. Three plants were about to become best friends in the most ingenious agricultural partnership ever developed. Corn, beans, and squash, the famous three sisters, weren't just planted together by accident. This was agricultural genius that would make modern farmers jealous. The beans would literally climb up those corn stalks like they were custom-made jungle gyms, reaching towards sunlight without needing any wooden poles or fancy support systems. Pretty clever, right? But here's where it gets even better. Those sprawling squash plants weren't just taking up space at ground level. They were working overtime as nature's own weed blockers. Their broad, prickly leaves created a living carpet that shaded the soil, keeping it cool and moist while choking out any weeds that dared to sprout. Talk about multitasking. The beans brought their own special talent to this partnership. Their roots actually pulled nitrogen from the air and pumped it into the soil, feeding their corn and squash neighbors like generous roommates sharing groceries. Meanwhile, the corn provided that perfect climbing structure, and the squash guarded the ground like a spiky security system. When harvest time rolled around, Native Americans had hit the nutritional jackpot. Beans were packed with protein, corn delivered energy-rich carbohydrates, and squash loaded them up with vitamins. Together, these three plants created a complete protein source that rivaled anything we find in modern supermarkets. Then, there's the storage game. Beans were often left to dry right on their vines until they rattled like tiny maracas in their pods. Once dried, they could last for years tucked away in baskets or underground pits. Winter soups and hearty stews depended on these protein-packed little gems when fresh meat was scarce. And the weird part is how they used every bit of the squash. The flesh got roasted, boiled, or mashed into a dozen different dishes. Seeds were toasted over fires for crunchy snacks that probably tasted better than our modern pumpkin seeds. Even the blossoms ended up in cooking pots. Nothing went to waste. Some tribes would plant these three sisters in circular mounds, others in long rows. The methods varied, but the results were always the same. Bigger harvests, healthier soil, and meals that kept entire communities fed through harsh winters. But even with all this agricultural brilliance happening on dry land, Native Americans knew that some of their most valuable foods were waiting in completely different places. While corn, beans, and squash fed millions of Native Americans, something else grew wild in the northern lakes that would become legendary. Wild rice wasn't actually rice at all. It was a grass that sprouted in shallow waters across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and southern Canada. The Ojibwe people called it manumin, meaning good berry, and considered it so sacred they had entire ceremonies around its harvest. Here's where things get interesting. You couldn't just wade into a lake and grab this stuff. Harvesting wild rice required serious skill and teamwork. Two people would paddle a birch bark canoe through the rice beds, while one person used wooden sticks called knockers to bend the tall grass over the canoe. Then, they'd whack the seed heads, sending thousands of dark grains tumbling into the boat. The rhythm had to be perfect. Too gentle and you'd get nothing. Too rough and you'd damage next year's crop. But the work wasn't over once they got back to shore. Fresh wild rice was completely inedible. It had to be dried in the sun for days, then parched over low fires to remove the tough outer hulls. People would actually dance on the rice in special moccasins to loosen those hulls, then winnow the grains in birch bark baskets. Talk about working for your dinner. The payoff was huge, though. Dried wild rice could last for months without spoiling, making it perfect winter food when lakes froze solid and hunting got dangerous. Women would boil it into porridge, mix it with maple syrup, or throw it into stews with whatever meat the hunters brought home. Then there's the Southwest, where completely different grains kept people alive in the desert. Amaranth grew wild across the region, producing tiny seeds packed with protein. Tribes would gather these seeds by the thousands, grinding them into flour on stone metats. The flour got shaped into flatbreads and cooked on hot stone slabs, basically ancient tortillas that could feed a family for days. Goosefoot, sunflower seeds, and even grass seeds all got the same treatment. Makes sense, right? When you're living in a place where corn might fail due to drought, you'd better know how to turn every edible seed into something filling. These ancient grains weren't just backup food. They were nutritional powerhouses that sustained entire communities through harsh winters and unpredictable seasons. While northern tribes perfected their canoe and knocker technique, southern desert dwellers were creating their own grain-grinding traditions that would influence cooking for generations. Speaking of gathering food that grew wild, berries and nuts offered their own unique challenges and rewards that required completely different skills. Native Americans knew something we're just rediscovering today. Wild foods pack way more nutrients than anything you'll find in a grocery store. Take blueberries, for instance. These little purple powerhouses grew wild across much of North America, and tribes would gather them by the basketful during summer months. But here's what's crazy. Wild blueberries contain nearly twice the antioxidants of cultivated ones. Then, there were chokecherries. Don't let the name fool you. They weren't trying to kill anyone. They got their name because they're super tart and make your mouth pucker like you just bit into a lemon. Smart tribal cooks would dry them first, which concentrated the sweetness and made them perfect for mixing into pemmican or winter stews. Let's not forget pawpaws, which taste like a cross between a banana and a mango. Weird, right? These tropical tasting fruits grew wild in eastern forests, and some tribes called them prairie bananas. They were so creamy and sweet that kids would climb trees just to get the ripest ones before anyone else could. But nuts? That's where things get really interesting. Acorns were like finding gold. Every fall, entire families would spend weeks gathering them from oak groves. The catch was they're incredibly bitter straight from the tree. Native Americans figured out they could soak them in running streams for days, sometimes weeks, until all the bitter tannins washed away. What remained was a mild, nutty flour perfect for making bread that could last months. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and pecans were easier. Crack them open, and you're good to go. Tribes would mix chopped nuts into cornmeal porridge, creating something that tasted like the world's first granola. The fat content was so high that a handful could keep you energized for hours of walking or hunting. And the weird part is how they turned cranberries into medicine. Long before anyone heard of vitamin C, tribes were using cranberries to treat everything from stomach problems to infections. They'd make bitter teas or mix them with maple syrup for a more palatable remedy. The real genius move was making trail mix before anyone called it that. Dried berries, crushed nuts, and sometimes a bit of dried meat all got bundled together in small pouches. Hunters and traders could carry these lightweight snacks for days without worrying about spoilage. While these wild treats kept Native Americans healthy and energized, they needed more substantial protein sources to fuel their active lifestyles. The hunt provided exactly what their bodies craved. When most people think about Native American hunting, they picture a lone warrior with a bow chasing a massive buffalo across the plains. Well, that's only part of the story. The reality was way more clever, and frankly, nothing went to waste. And I mean nothing. Take deer hunting, for example. Tribes didn't just shoot arrows and hope for the best. They built elaborate drive systems, herding entire groups of deer into V-shaped stone walls that funneled animals toward waiting hunters. Smart, right? But here's where it gets really interesting. After the kill, every single part of that deer had a job. Meat for food, obviously. Bones became needles, scrapers, and arrow points. Hide turned into clothes, blankets, and shelter. Even the brains were used to tan leather. Yeah, you read that right. Brain-tanned leather was considered premium stuff. Then there's the bison situation out west. These massive animals provided everything a tribe needed to survive. One buffalo could feed a family for months when properly preserved. The trick was making jerky, thin strips of meat dried in the sun until they turned into nature's protein bars. But wait, it gets better. They created something called pemmican by mixing this dried meat with rendered fat and berries. This stuff could last for years without spoiling. No refrigeration needed. Let's not forget the smaller game that kept bellies full year-round. Rabbits, squirrels, prairie dogs, and even turtles ended up in cooking pots regularly. Rabbit drives were community events where entire villages would work together using long nets to catch hundreds of rabbits in one go. Talk about efficiency. And the weird part is what some northern tribes considered delicacies. Bird brains, for instance, were special occasion food. Seal blubber wasn't just eaten, it was the primary source of fat and calories in Arctic regions. Whale hunting required incredible skill and courage. But one successful hunt could feed an entire village through the harshest winter. The hunting wasn't random either. Tribes followed seasonal patterns, knowing exactly when elk would migrate, when turkeys would be fattest, when bears would emerge from hibernation. They understood animal behavior better than most modern wildlife biologists. But here's what really blows my mind. They had backup plans for their backup plans. If large game was scarce, they knew how to trap smaller animals. If land hunting failed, they turned to something completely different for survival. The waters held secrets too, and coastal tribes had mastered ways of harvesting the ocean that would make today's fishermen jealous. While Native Americans mastered the land, they were equally brilliant when it came to harvesting the waters. Rivers, lakes, and coastlines provided an incredible bounty that kept entire communities fed year-round. Salmon runs were like nature's grocery delivery service. These fish would swim upstream in massive numbers, practically throwing themselves at waiting nets and traps. Native tribes built ingenious contraptions called weirs, basically underwater fences that guided fish into waiting baskets. No fancy equipment needed, just clever engineering and perfect timing. But here's where it gets interesting. Different tribes had wildly different fishing techniques depending on their location. Coastal communities became masters with bone hooks, sinew lines, and dugout canoes that could handle rough ocean waters. Meanwhile, river tribes perfected the art of spear fishing, standing motionless for hours until the perfect moment to strike. Then there's the shellfish situation. Clams, mussels, and oysters were like nature's fast food. No cooking required if you were in a hurry. Coastal tribes would wade into tidal pools with simple wooden rakes or just use their bare hands to dig up dinner. The shells weren't wasted either. They became tools, decorations, and even currency for trading with inland tribes. Storage was the real game changer, though. Fresh fish spoils fast, but Native Americans figured out smoking techniques that would make any barbecue pitmaster jealous. They built special racks over slow-burning fires, creating perfectly preserved fish that could last through brutal winters. Some smoked salmon was so well preserved it stayed edible for over a year. And the weird part is how much they valued fish eggs. What we call caviar today was considered premium food back then too. Roe was carefully harvested, dried, and stored like precious jewels. Makes sense when you think about it. Those tiny eggs packed serious nutrition. Seaweed might sound gross to modern taste buds, but coastal tribes treated it like a superfood. They'd collect different varieties, dry them on rocks, and use them as salty seasonings for other dishes. Talk about eating your vegetables. Sturgeon fishing was particularly intense. These massive fish could feed entire families for days, but catching one required serious teamwork and razor-sharp timing. The biggest sturgeon could weigh hundreds of pounds, basically like landing a small whale. What's fascinating is how these water harvests connected to trade networks. Dried fish traveled hundreds of miles inland, traded for corn, pottery, and other goods. Coastal tribes had serious economic power thanks to their fishing skills, but water wasn't the only place Native Americans found sustenance. Underground, an entire world of edible roots and wild plants waited to be discovered. Underground treasures were everywhere if you knew where to look. Native Americans became masters at reading the land, spotting the subtle signs that pointed to dinner hiding beneath their feet. Cattail roots were like finding gold in a swamp. These thick, starchy tubers grew at the bottom of cattail plants near water. People would wade into marshes during fall and winter, feeling around with their toes until they hit something solid. The roots tasted nutty and sweet when roasted over coals. But here's the weird part. Cattails were basically grocery stores. The shoots could be eaten like asparagus, the pollen made flour, and the fluffy seed heads worked as tinder for fires. Wild onions grew almost everywhere, and Native Americans had a nose for finding them. They'd follow the smell, then dig up bulbs that added serious flavor to otherwise bland meals. These weren't your modern supermarket onions, though. They packed more punch and grew in clusters underground. Then there were camas bulbs, which tribes in the Pacific Northwest treated like buried treasure. These blue-flowered plants hid sweet potato-like bulbs that took days to cook properly in earth ovens. Families would gather for huge camas harvests, digging up thousands of bulbs at once. The catch? Death camas looked almost identical, but would kill you. Talk about high-stakes foraging. Spring brought a different kind of treasure hunt. Dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, and wild garlic pushed up through the soil when winter stores ran low. These plants packed vitamins that prevented scurvy and other nasty diseases. Smart timing, right? But the sweetest discovery came from trees themselves. Maple and birch sap wasn't just sticky stuff. It was liquid candy. People would tap trees in early spring, collecting gallons of clear sap that got boiled down into thick, golden syrup. It took about 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup, so this was serious work. Storage became an art form too. Underground cache pits lined with grass and bark kept roots fresh for months. These hidden pantries stayed cool in summer and didn't freeze solid in winter. Some pits were so well designed they could preserve food for years. The real genius was knowing exactly when to dig. Too early and roots weren't fully developed. Too late and they'd gotten tough or started sprouting. Native Americans tracked seasonal patterns like natural calendars, passing down precise timing through generations. All this digging and gathering might sound exhausting, but it was just the beginning. Wait until you hear about the truly creative ways people survived when regular food sources disappeared completely. When winter hit the Arctic and food got scarce, Native Americans didn't just survive, they got creative. Take Eskimo ice cream, also called akutak. This wasn't your typical dessert. People mixed whipped animal fat with berries and fresh snow, creating something that sounds weird but actually packed serious calories when you needed them most. The fat gave energy, berries added vitamins, and snow? Well, it was nature's free mixer. But here's where things get really interesting. Nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, went to waste in native communities. Fish heads that most people would toss became soup stock. Bones got cracked open for marrow or ground into meal. Even fish scales were saved and used in some regions. Makes sense when you think about it, right? When your next meal isn't guaranteed, every scrap counts. Desert tribes faced their own survival puzzle. The Southwest gets brutally hot, but mesquite trees drop sweet pods that became lifesavers. People gathered these pods and roasted them over fires, then ground them into flour that tasted surprisingly sugary. It was like nature's own candy bar, except it could feed a family. When times got really tough, Native Americans turned to foods that would make most of us cringe today. Tree bark became dinner. Not just any bark, though. They knew which inner bark, called cambium, was actually edible and nutritious. Pine, birch, and aspen trees all had their place on the emergency menu. Cactus paddles got the same treatment in desert areas, thorns carefully removed before cooking. Then there's the drinks that kept people going. Forget your morning coffee. Many tribes had yaupon holly tea, nicknamed black drink. This stuff packed more caffeine than most energy drinks today. Warriors and leaders would drink it during ceremonies, getting a serious buzz that could last hours. Some tribes even fermented various plants into alcoholic beverages for special occasions. The weird part is how some of these survival foods actually tasted good. Fermented fish might sound disgusting, but it developed complex flavors that many people genuinely enjoyed. Fermentation also preserved food for months without refrigeration, which was pretty genius when you think about it. What's really amazing is the knowledge behind all this. Native Americans didn't just randomly try eating bark or mixing fat with snow. They understood nutrition, preservation, and flavor combinations in ways that took scientists centuries to figure out. Every weird-sounding food served a purpose, whether it was surviving Arctic winters or desert heat. These creative survival techniques kept entire civilizations fed for thousands of years, proving that sometimes the strangest foods make perfect sense.